most of you know, this is a group that a group of us started about 8 years ago. And the time is passing, and we've put on about 40 programs like this now, about 5 or 6 a year. If you're not on our mailing list, and you would like to be, and we would really encourage you to become a member, we have a number of these forms for the first time tonight that if you've filled it out and give it to me or send it to the address on there, we'll make sure you're on our mailing list and know about our future events, including on November 16th again, here at the New Jersey Historical Society. Guy Sterling, who's a member of our executive committee, retired Star Ledger journalist, has done a lot of work about the High Street fire 100 years ago, very much like the Triangle Shirt Factory fire that everybody knows about. But a year before that, there was really a terrible fire in a garment factory up on High Street, which also led to a number of labor reforms and fire safety reforms. That's on November 16th here. And then next February 2nd, we're going to mark the 150th anniversary of Abraham Lincoln's visit to Newark before his first inauguration. Tom McCabe here in the front row from Rutgers is going to stretch himself and talk about Lincoln's visit. We've also have Harold Holzer, a leading Lincoln scholar, joining us that night, February 2nd, at the Newark Public Library. Not here. That meeting will be at the Newark Public Library. And then Rob Steinbaum is, with luck, will have a program about Chinatown in Newark. And with similar luck, later in the spring, I'm putting together a program that I'm calling When Princeton Was in Newark, Aaron Burr and the Founding of the College of New Jersey, which is a look at 18th century Newark. As so often, we are really grateful to the New Jersey Historical Society to host this program. And I would ask Linda Epps, the director of the New Jersey Historical Society, to bring a word of greeting.
Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
And again, it's my privilege to welcome you to the New Jersey Historical Society. I see a lot of first-timers here, or at least I don't recognize some faces, and that's unusual because I usually know about 98% of the people in the room. But I'm assuming that there are some attorney types here this evening that don't visit the New Jersey Historical Society. Shame on you. History and law are intimately bound. I think Brennan would have said that. Maybe he did, I don't know. But welcome to the New Jersey Historical Society, and do not let this first time be your last time. We're always pleased to have company, and I know for many of you this has become like a second home, and I'm very happy about that. Justice Brennan was known for his, I think I had this right, for his liberal policies, always making sure that current justices read and interpreted the Constitution within a 20th century context. I often wonder about the Tea Party movement and their rallies to get back to what the framers had in mind. And they perhaps needed to, as Brennan put it, answer the ultimate question, and this is a quote from him: what do the words of the text mean in our time? For the genius of the Constitution rests not in any static meaning it might have had in a world that is dead and gone, but in the adaptability of its great principles to cope with current problems and current needs. Brennan's life in Newark would have coincided, I believe he was born in 1917. His life would have coincided with an event that historians like to call the Great Migration. He would have lived here during the rapid ethnic and racial change in the city. And I was not surprised when I read these words by him, and quote, "Those whom we would banish from society or from the human community itself often speak in too faint a voice to be heard above society's demand for punishment. It is the particular role of courts to hear these voices, for the Constitution declares that the majoritarian chorus may not alone dictate the conditions of social life. So we're all looking forward to hearing and learning more about Justice Brennan this evening. We need his voice during this challenging time to help guide us in interpreting our history to chart a course for our tomorrow. So once again, welcome to the New Jersey Historical Society. Do not be a stranger. Come back again.
Thank you, Linda. This program tonight is one that we've been looking forward to for quite some time. Dan O'Flaherty, who worked with Rob Steinbaum and some others, Guy Sterling, to put the event together, has been telling us that this was coming for some time, and we wanted to time it around the publication of Seth Stern's new book. So Dan, who is another member of our executive committee, a professor of economics at Columbia University, will be kind of moderating tonight and playing traffic cop. Dan, you want to introduce the members of the panel?
Thank you. We've been wanting to do this for a very long time. I couldn't imagine a Newark History Society without a Justice Brennan program on Justice Brennan, and we've been hoping that this book would get done, and Seth has come through. It's another story. It's wonderful that finally this biography by Seth Stern and Steve Wermiel has been published. It's been favorably reviewed in the New York Times and the Washington Post. The Washington Post review this weekend called it perhaps the best judicial biography ever. We don't like this perhaps stuff. I've asked the panelists to do is to turn the question around. We know that we can't have a Newark History Society without Justice Brennan. I've asked the panelists tonight to focus on the question of what would Justice Brennan have been without Newark, to try to get what are the connections between the extraordinary career that Justice Brennan had and the extraordinary milieu in Newark that he grew up in. So we've got an incredibly good panel tonight. I'll go in the order. First, Seth Stern, co-author of this book. He's a graduate of Harvard Law School. His paycheck comes from Congressional Quarterly, where he's a journalist. The combination of law degree and journalism is one that is extraordinarily dear to my heart. And he'll be our main speaker tonight. Then we have three different kinds of comments from very distinguished people from New Jersey. Our first speaker will be Professor Ed Hartnett from Seton Hall Law School. Professor Hartnett is the Richard J. Hughes Professor of Law at Seton Hall. We know Richard J. Hughes, and has specializes in federal law and especially on the Supreme Court, has written extensively about the Supreme Court. Our next speaker will be Assemblyman Tom Giblin. Assemblyman Giblin is no stranger to the Newark History Society. All of us know that he is a walking encyclopedia of all things Irish and all things political in New Jersey. But tonight he brings, in addition to that perspective, he brings another perspective. As president of Local 68 of the International Union of Operating Engineers, He is president of, in many ways, the successory local to Local 55, which was Justice Brennan's father's local. Finally, our final speaker will be Georgiana Franklin Brennan. This is, I think, one audience where I can introduce her first as the daughter of Pierce Franklin. She is also the son-in-law of Justice Brennan. Daughter-in-law. Oh. I've been working too hard. Okay, so I think we've got a panel. We're going to ask them to speak for a limited amount of time, and then we'll have questions from the floor, which I know is usually the best part of these programs. Seth?
Well, thank you so much for having me here tonight. There are a lot of people in the audience, and most of my fellow panelists were so helpful in my research and reporting on the book. And this is really a treat for me to be able to talk about Justice Brennan in his hometown and a place that meant so much to him. William J. Brennan Jr. was a somewhat little-known state Supreme Court justice from New Jersey and former corporate labor lawyer when President Eisenhower picked him for the Supreme Court in 1956. In the course of 34 terms on the Supreme Court, he emerged as perhaps the most influential justice of the 20th century. And that's not my analysis. Those are the words of Justice Antonin Scalia, with whom Justice Brennan didn't necessarily agree about a whole lot. Justice Brennan had a tremendous influence in so many areas of law, and every issue of his time and our time, from affirmative action and abortion to school desegregation and school prayer, the death penalty and the rights of criminal defendants, women's rights, and welfare rights. It really spans the gamut of every facet of constitutional law he had a hand in and helped shape. But as I said in a column in the Star-Ledger in June on the occasion of the dedication of the statue of Justice Brennan, you really can't understand the justice that he became without understanding his roots here in Newark. I'm going to make a confession first of all, so you don't think it's sort of false advertising. The period of his life, 50 years in New Jersey before he joined the U.S. Supreme Court at the age of 50, is compressed in the book. It's only 3 of 22 chapters. So tonight, you may think that this is Justice Brennan of New Jersey should be the title, but in fact, we sort of tell this story in relatively short order because given his influence on the court, we had to get to the U.S. Supreme Court. But we do try to tell the story, and I hope that you get a sense in the book of how Newark influenced him. Justice Brennan was born in 1906 on an unpaved stretch of New Street, just beyond the old Morris Canal. It was behind the Daily, I believe it was the Daily Hat Factory. Now, I know those details because of these wonderful maps at the Newark Public Library. It's an incredible find. They're color-coded. They tell you what houses were made of brick or wood and what the street looked like and all the neighboring businesses. So that's just sort of one of many nuggets that we got from our research here in Newark. Justice Brennan, his formative years were actually spent in Vailsburg, and it's incredible to think of Vailsburg then was really this sort of rural outpost on the far western edge of Newark. He grew up, and as a teenager, him and his younger brother, Charlie, worked at a dairy across the street. Justice Brennan stuck his younger brother. He sort of claimed seniority. His brother had to milk the cows, and then Justice Brennan would deliver the milk. But to have that image of 100 years ago that there were dairy farms in Vailsburg, it's quite amazing. Justice Brennan was the son of William J. Brennan Sr., and his mother was Bridget Agnes McDermott. They were both immigrants from County Roscommon in Ireland, and they grew up 10 miles apart, but given how rural it was, they would have never met in County Roscommon. They met, though, here when they both came to Newark. The Newark that his father moved to from Trenton around 1894 we describe in the book as a brawny industrial boomtown. It really was in that era. The city boosters like to claim that they made everything manufactured at the time, and it was only a slight exaggeration. It was an extraordinary sort of industrial city for great opportunity for immigrants, but it was also a place of great poverty for many of those immigrants. This was several decades after the great Irish migration caused by the famine. Justice Brennan's father arrived at a time where most of the immigrants were from southern and eastern Europe, and he started making his way up as a manual laborer, and then he became a stationary fireman at the Ballantine Brewery. I did not know what a stationary fireman was. I relied heavily on Mr. Giblin, among others, to teach me. I know now more about brewery operations than I ever thought I would. My wife thought I was crazy. I was reading manuals on brewery operation, and then she saw it was 3 sentences in the book. She couldn't understand. She thought I was just completely pathological in my detail. Justice Brennan's father worked his way up through his union and then into politics, a very typical sort of Irish-American story in the early 20th century. He became a leader of his local and then the national union, and then they were solidly middle class, but that didn't mean it was easy raising Justice Brennan and his 7 brothers and sisters. It was a large family, and Justice Brennan's, one of his early memories that he told my co-author in the course of their 60 hours of interviews together was living on the edge of Forest Hill, sort of the upper class neighborhood, and he lived just on the wrong side of the street and got his first sense of class differences at a very young age. Justice Brennan's father in 1916 was a union leader, and there was a trolley car strike, and he had a pivotal role in that trolley car strike. It didn't end well for the union. It sort of got crushed. The trolley car company, the utility, was powerful. The police sided with them. And it was a defining moment, I think, for Justice Brennan. As he was 10 years old at the time, he sort of saw how government power could be used against the little guy. But then shortly after, I think, a formative experience, he got a very different sense of how government could be used for good. His father became a city commissioner. There was a new form of government in Newark where a city commission had both legislative and executive power. His father was elected as one of the first commissioners, became the director of public safety, overseeing the fire and police departments. Justice Brennan's father was an enormously popular politician. To give you some sense, when he died in 1930 at a relatively young age, we actually open the book this way. The line to pay respects, he was lying in state, stretched through the night. It was equivalent to 9% of the city's population. I mean, extraordinary. We're talking the sort of numbers that Martin Luther King might get, or a president. I mean, he was an extraordinarily popular man, he grew up, Justice Brennan, the son of a very famous politician, and that was good and that was bad. He learned his father's sort of economic progressivism. He believed in economic justice, human dignity, the right of a living wage. So that really was inculcated in Justice Brennan at a very young age. But there was another more negative aspect. His father, kind of ironic for a brewery worker, former brewery worker, wound up having to help the U.S. Treasury agents enforce prohibition in the 1920s. He did so grudgingly. He wasn't one of these politicians who was bought off by the people running liquor off of boats off the coast. But it was an impossible position because the working class people didn't like prohibition, the brewery owners didn't like prohibition. The only people who liked it, sort of the anti-saloon league and the church folks, so he couldn't win and came under tremendous criticism from the pro-prohibition folks, and terrible things were said about him in the Newark newspapers by the pro-prohibition people. And Justice Brennan really took that to heart at a young age. He was turned off to politics. I think some of my fellow panelists might touch on that. But that, again, was a formative experience. He did not want any part in politics after seeing how his father was mistreated. Justice Brennan, as a teenager, attended Barringer High School, and I was really sorry to see recently in the Star-Ledger the description of the chaos at Barringer. I mean, in his era, it was equivalent of Stuyvesant. I mean, it was a magnet for the city's best immigrants, whether they were Jewish or Italian or Irish. They all went to Barringer High School. And so it's really unfortunate to see how it is now, and hopefully it can return to what it was when Justice Brennan was a student there. He went off to college at the University of Pennsylvania in 1924. We were just talking, it's fascinating. He grew up 2 miles from Seton Hall. He could have walked there each day, but his father in particular and his mother wanted him to go to the Ivy Leagues. His father had a 6th grade education in Ireland, but education was so important to his father. His mother, his image was Princeton, but his father very much wanted him to go off to Penn and Wharton in particular. There's this notion that Justice Brennan went on to become a corporate labor lawyer, that his father might have rolled over in his grave, as some writers have said, knowing that his son was on the opposite side of labor as a corporate labor lawyer. But the truth is, as we show in the book, was his father was the one who set him off on that path. He was the one who encouraged him to go to Wharton. He encouraged him then to go to Harvard Law School. And we show in the book it was his father who got him his first job, a summer job at Pitney, Harden & Skinner, one of the top law firms, a very prestigious law firm, and one that didn't hire many Catholics or people who hadn't gone to Princeton. So he was really a trailblazer in that sense. He came back to Newark in 1931 from law school and went to work at Pitney, Harden & Skinner. At a time, it was the depths of the Great Depression. He was lucky to have a job. There were lawyers at that time, had to make ends meet by driving taxis. But it was not easy for him. He wasn't paid particularly well. It wasn't an era of high-paid law firm associates. And he really was affected by the sight of his fellow citizens lining up for bread lines. His father had passed away, and it wasn't easy on the family. His mother was still at home with some of his younger siblings. So it was a very difficult time for the family. And I think it was a very formative experience. And I look, he wrote in 1970 a very important welfare rights decision, Goldberg v. Kelly. And it was a decision that said that welfare recipients had due process rights. You can't just cut off their benefits without giving them a chance to appeal. And I don't think he ever said so explicitly, but I think his notion of the importance of welfare was shaped by seeing what had happened in the Great Depression here in Newark. By the end of the 1930s, he was a partner at his law firm, and eventually they added his name to the firm. It became known as, I believe, Pitney, Harden, Skinner, and Brennan. He was a much sought-after labor lawyer. He moved to the Oranges. I'm going to confess I still can't get my Oranges straight. But he moved to the suburbs. He was doing very well. He was sort of a big shot in Newark. He would go to the club and shake hands. He knew everyone in the room. He was joining corporate boards. And he gave all of that up in 1949, and he became a state judge. His salary went from $80,000 a year to $20,000 a year. This came at enormous personal sacrifice, but he viewed it as very important. I think part of it, he had inherited his father's sort of reformist instincts. His father had wanted to reform his union, had wanted to reform the city government, and I think Justice Brennan had that same impulse. There was a reputation for New Jersey's courts was not exactly high. It was known as Jersey justice, which meant very slow and not particularly well-reasoned. And under Chief Justice Arthur Vanderbilt, they created a new framework of the courts. Justice Brennan joined as a judge, first at the trial level. He was in Jersey City. Chief Justice Vanderbilt sent him there to sort of clean up the crooked courts, and then he came to Newark, and he then was an intermediate appellate judge. And then in 1952, Governor Driscoll named him to the New Jersey Supreme Court. But part of the deal was that Justice Brennan had to leave Newark. There were too many justices already on the court from Essex County, and for balance sake, by joining the court, he agreed to leave Essex County. And he did so. His family, they moved to Rumson, where it was sort of idyllic. They loved Rumson, but they also missed Newark very much. And their family was still here, and they continued to come back here. And that was true after President Eisenhower named him to the U.S. Supreme Court. Justice Brennan, much of his family was still in New Jersey. His son, Bill, settled in Princeton. And I get confused, was it Christmas or Thanksgiving that you did in Princeton and the other was in Washington?
Washington, it was Christmas, Thanksgiving for us.
Thanksgiving in Princeton. Okay, so he continued to come back, and it's interesting. I don't want to read passages of the book, but there was one thing in 1967. Sort of his worlds converged. There was a case involving Martin Luther King had been cited for criminal contempt in Alabama for a civil rights demonstration he had organized in 1963. Justice Brennan was outraged that a majority of his colleagues voted to uphold the contempt charge. And he wrote one of the most caustic dissents he had ever written up to that point. He wrote that, quote, "We cannot permit fears of riots and civil disobedience generated by slogans like Black Power to divert our attention from what is here at stake." That was how he ended that dissent. That was issued on June 12, 1967. And we detail how exactly 1 month later, on July 12th, the riots season, the summer, it's unfortunately every summer at the time there were riots, and the first was here in Newark. And he was deeply affected by the damage that was done. It didn't reach Vailsburg, where he grew up. It's sort of an unnatural barrier. I think it's the Garden State Parkway, sort of separated Vailsburg from the rest of the city, and I think saved it from some of the damage, but the pace of white flight only accelerated, and that he was continued to feel connected to Newark. He came back in 1986. I watched this video. He did a documentary for PBS, and he came back to Newark, and he was so excited. He's 80 years old, a Supreme Court justice for 30 years. He sort of bounds into the house where he lived in Vailsburg. The current residents are showing him around, and he was so excited to show the spot in the house where him and his brother had to change out of their dirty clothes when they came home from the dairy in the morning. And that was, 65 years earlier. So he still felt this deep attachment to Newark. I want to end, and I don't want to prattle on too much, but I want to end by making the point that Newark doesn't tell you everything about Justice Brennan in a few respects. One, I mentioned how his father, sort of economic justice and the lessons that he imparted to Justice Brennan. But there was another part of Commissioner Brennan tenure, and that was he was not so concerned about civil liberties. He was not particularly worried about cracking down on what was viewed as subversives and radicals in the 1920s. People accused of being communists. He rejected a protest on behalf of the Italian-American anarchists Sacco and Vanzetti, who were later executed. He also felt fine cracking down on obscenity. One of the great stories is that as a law student at Harvard Law School, Justice Brennan, in a class, the professor sort of talking all about this great New Jersey court decision, reversing a decision, sort of limiting the showing of a movie here in Newark. And it wasn't until the end of that discussion that Justice Brennan was talking, that the professor was talking about his father. So he goes home from law school and says, "Hey, Dad, they were talking about that case." And Commissioner Brennan was not too impressed with what he was learning in law school. But the other point I wanted to make, there are areas, this notion of empathy. President Obama has really emphasized that as a characteristic he wants in the justices he chooses. I think Justice Brennan embodied the idea of empathy, whether it was for minorities, African Americans, or women. He really embodied that, the ability to empathize with people. But unlike President Obama sort of emphasized life experience as the wellspring of Justice Sotomayor's empathy, and that wasn't the case with Justice Brennan. As I mentioned, he grew up middle class. It wasn't like he identified as poor. He lived in Newark in an era before the great Southern migration and left Newark before it really accelerated. And so he didn't grow up around many African Americans. His father was actually quite sympathetic and tripled the number of African American officers on the police force from 1 to 3, but still in that era, it was a major step, and the Urban League, African American leaders really viewed him as a friend of their community, but it was a small community in that era. And so his empathy didn't come from his experience here in Newark necessarily. So I don't want to go too far that Justice Brennan sort of his youth informed everything that he became. I think that I'm going to leave it there. I don't want to talk too long, and hopefully we could engage some of this more in the question and answer. Thank you.
Please hold questions. We'll have our three panelists speak, and then we'll have questions. Just wanted to tell you that the books are for sale, $21, and you're welcome to get it. It's better than Barnes & Noble.
It's a 40% discount.
It's somewhat dangerous to invite a law professor to talk about Justice William Brennan. As Seth has noted, Justice Brennan has been widely regarded as the most influential judge of the 20th century. He's a key participant on the Warren Court, a court that's been described both by its admirers and by its critics as revolutionary. Indeed, Justice Brennan was so significant to that revolutionary Warren Court that a number of major scholars think that the Warren Court would be better described as the Brennan Court. What's the danger? The danger is you get a law professor who's accustomed to teaching classes that go on for an hour and a half or more. I could talk here for hours and hours. The Warren Court itself, or as some would have it, the Brennan Court, was of course a product of its time. As Scott Poe has noted, it was a time of idealism and a time of hubris. The Warren Court functioning, again, following Scott Poe here, functioning as part of the Kennedy-Johnson liberalism, praised by some as combining Kennedy's rhetoric with Johnson's ability to do the deal, a blend, you might say, of the best and the brightest of Camelot and the Great Society, but without the compromises over money or the taint of Vietnam. And like all of us, Justice Brennan was a product of his time. But in this form, I want to use my limited time to suggest ways in which Justice Brennan's particular experiences in Newark and in New Jersey might have influenced his thinking as a justice. And there were two aspects of that experience that particularly struck me in reading Seth's wonderful book. The first is how witnessing his father's experience here in Newark soured him on electoral politics. Seth reports that Brennan at age 16 decided, I saw what it did to my father and I wanted no part of it. What a filthy business the whole thing was. This distaste never left him. Even decades later, witnessing the battle over Robert Bork's nomination to the Supreme Court, Brennan was apparently less troubled by the prospect of a colleague joining the court who was so strongly opposed to Brennan's own legal views than he was by the way the confirmation process had come to resemble a political campaign. The second aspect that struck me is that Justice Brennan became a judge in the New Jersey court system at a unique time, a time when the New Jersey judiciary was transformed by the 1947 Constitution from a rather creaky, old-fashioned system with such oddities as a 16-member highest state court staffed in part by part-time judges, to a model of a modern court system with streamlined procedures, a powerful Chief Justice, and judges given nearly as much independence as any judges in the nation. These two experiences, it seems to me, led Justice Brennan to distrust electoral politics and to trust judicial power, a perspective that I see reflected in a wide range of Justice Brennan's decisions over the course of his career, 1956 to 1990, demonstrating a strong confidence and trust in judicial power and a corresponding lack of confidence and trust in electoral politics. I'll briefly mention 8 that I've picked out that I think reflect this, ranging from 1958 to 1989, pretty much covering the gamut. And I hope I can touch on these briefly, and if I go on too long, please cut me off. 1958, rather junior justice, he writes the decision in Cooper versus Allen. Yes, it's uniquely signed by all 9 justices, but as Seth well demonstrates, that opinion was largely Justice Brennan's handiwork. And that's particularly true of that opinion's extraordinarily robust conception of judicial power, asserting that when government officials take an oath to support the Constitution, they are swearing to adhere to the Supreme Court's interpretation of the Constitution. That's an idea that would have been outrageous to a wide range of presidents, including Jefferson, Jackson, and Lincoln. The 1962 decision in Baker versus Carr brought the judiciary into the legislative districting battles. And ever since then, courts have played a major role in establishing how legislative districts are drawn. We'll soon see another round of such litigation in the wake of the 2010 census. New York Times versus Sullivan in 1964 made it far more difficult for elected officials to recover for defamatory falsehoods about them, contributing in part to today's political environment where the other day David Brooks, for example, says most normal people don't want to run for office these days. A lot of good people just don't want to run. And as David Brooks again says, I think that's one of the reasons we have people like Palladino. Elrod versus Burns, 1976, holding that political patronage, a practice nearly as old as the Republic, and the glue that holds many political organizations together, is generally unconstitutional. The 1978 decision in Monell versus New York, reversing a 1961 interpretation of an 1871 statute, held that municipalities could be forced to pay money damages to individuals for violating federal law. And Owen versus Independence in 1980 held that municipalities cannot take advantage of the various immunity doctrines available to the officers of those municipalities. Under these decisions, federal judges can force cities to pay damages to individuals, even when the elected officials in those cities are convinced that there are more important needs that must be met with people's tax dollars. Justice Brennan was never able to get 5 votes for his view that the Constitution does not provide the states with sovereign immunity, obtaining 4 votes for that view in the Atascadero case in 1985. He did get 5 votes, though, for the next best thing. That is in Pennsylvania versus Union Gas in 1989. He got 5 votes for the conclusion that Congress could use its broad power under the Commerce Clause to abrogate a state's sovereign immunity, thereby empowering federal judges to make the states pay damages to individuals, again, even when the elected officials in those states are convinced that there are more important needs that must be met with the people's tax dollars. Union Gas is a great case for sort of teaching purposes. Among other reasons, it's particularly odd because Justice Brennan managed to get 5 votes, but the 5th vote in that case, Justice White's vote in that case, noted that he agreed with Justice Brennan's conclusion, but not with much of his reasoning, and didn't explain his own reasoning. Union Gas, perhaps in part because of Justice White's very odd vote in that case, was overruled after Justice Brennan's retirement in the Seton tribe case in 1996. Now, whether one thinks that these decisions are correct or incorrect, wise or unwise, right or wrong, good or bad, I think they do reflect that from the beginning of his career to the end, Justice Brennan demonstrated a strong confidence and trust in judicial power and a corresponding lack of trust, lack of confidence in electoral politics. Seth's book leads me to think that those views were shaped, at least in part, by his experiences here before he left for Washington, D.C. in 1956.
First of all, at the outset, I want to pay particular attention to Guy Sterling. There's a beautiful statue up at the Essex County Hall of Records. I know that Guy had a committee working on it, but he was the one who made it all happen. His determination and his stubbornness made it become a reality. So we want to thank Guy for his work on that. And the same as far as this book. It was a long time in the making, but was really set that kind of brought it to fruition, and all of us are beneficiaries of his great work in research, and I know many of us have enjoyed reading the book, so I want to thank Seth for his work on that. I'm going to talk somewhat about William J. Brennan Sr. And how it all ties into William J. Brennan Jr., the Justice. William J. Brennan Sr., 1872 to 1930. He died at a relatively young age, 58 years of age. He was born in a place called French Park, County Roscommon. If you get off the plane in Dublin, it's kind of a straight road. It's about 120 miles from Dublin, and ends up, of course, that road ends up in the far parts of Mayo. But it's a very small community, at best, even in today's standards, 1,500 people. Farming community. He left County Roscommon, to come. First of all, he went to Staffordshire, England, first to kind of pursue a potential career working in pottery. That didn't seem to kind of work well. Then he made the move to Trenton, and then subsequently to Newark. And as was noted, that he met his wife, Bridget Agnes McDermott, who was from Castlereagh, which is, like I said, 7 or 8 miles from French Park. It's mentioned in the book they met on Plain Street, but remembering conversations with my parents, they talked about this Plain Street dance hall where many of the immigrants in those years kind of met each other. I'm not sure exactly what location on Plain Street was at, and of course that's now University Avenue. For many years, my sense is that Justice Brennan kind of lived in the shadow of his father. It was almost until he was appointed to the court in 1949, and he was, 43, 44 years of age, that it was probably the first reference about being the son of Commissioner William J. Brennan. So that's probably wasn't an easy road to travel. The interesting thing is my father and Dan's father were members of the International Brotherhood of Firemen and Oilers. Their office for many years, and probably during Bill Brennan's time, was up at a place called the Labor Lyceum, which is, believe it or not, the building still exists. It's right at the corner of South 14th Street and Springfield Avenue. But the tradition was years ago was that you became a member of Local 55, started off as an apprentice or an oiler or a coal passer. You got your fireman's license, and then when you wanted to become an engineer, that was a progression to another local, which at that time was and still is Local 68 of the International Union of Operating Engineers. About 10 years ago, the International Brotherhood of Firemen and Oilers were merged with the Service Employees International Union. It was a relatively small union nationwide at that time, with about 20,000 people, which is not a lot of people, to say the least. But as was talked about, Justice Brennan's father worked in P. Ballantyne's, which was at 57 Freeman Street, which is right off of Raymond Boulevard in Newark. People think about breweries. I look at different people here. You go back 40 years ago, there was 4 breweries: Ballantyne's, Pabst, Budweiser. That's 40 years ago. But the point I'm getting at is that if you went back into the 20s and 30s, in communities like Harrison, Elizabeth, Newark, there was probably somewhere in the vicinity of about 40 breweries. And for all practical purposes, these folks were unionized either by the Teamsters with the production side, or as far as the boilers and refrigeration equipment, either by the operating engineers or the Brotherhood of Firemen and Oilers. That particular background, I think had an influence as far as the justice is concerned. An interesting thing at that time, you talk about Vailsburg, and believe it or not, Vailsburg is only under the umbrella of the city of Newark just a little over 100 years. I think it's 1908. Vailsburg was a separate community. In fact, it was named after a Dr. Henry Vail, I believe, right, Mike? That's his name. And that was kind of akin to going to the suburbs, because most of the Irish Catholics either went to St. Rose's Parish, St. Rose of Lima up in Roseville, or St. Aloysius on Fleming Avenue, or St. Antoninus on South Orange Avenue. To take a step to move into Vailsburg was a little bit of an elite statement. And the same thing as far as the schooling is concerned. The tendency of most immigrants in those particular years was to send their kids to parochial schools. They were very much in sync with the religion, and there was a strong influence, especially in Irish immigrants' lives, that they had an affinity as far as the church is concerned, and kind of showed like a little bit of the progressive thinking of the justice's father, about the issue of going to Barringer, about going on to UPenn and the Wharton School, and then of course Harvard. That was not the place where Irish Catholic students were going at that time. They were going to the Seton Hall Preps, and going to the St. Peter's, and they were going to Seton Hall, and they really couldn't even afford, in a sense, to kind of move out of town. So that really shows that William J. Brennan Sr. really understood the value of these educational institutions, and really kind of set high marks as far as his son and the other children of the Brennan family. It's been said that the justice in those years was kind of told what to do. In other words, he didn't really kind of put too much resistance up to his parents, and even when it's mentioned sometime back about that the justice even got married and was afraid to tell the folks at home, and he kind of lived that way for 3 years? 3 years, which is interesting, because he didn't want to have any offend his parents, and actually had eloped to, I guess, Elkton, Maryland in those years. But Newark in 1917, we changed the form of government. Prior to that, there used to be 16 wards in Newark. They called the governmental officials aldermen, and there was 2 in each ward. So you got to picture that. 32 people plus the mayor getting together to make decisions about Newark and the community. You think you have challenges today. I can imagine that must have been a hurdle. But the government was changed in 1917. The interesting thing, the Commissioner Brennan was elected 4 times, and he actually declined the position of mayor. The rule of thumb was whoever got the top vote, they could have taken the position of mayor. He took the position of Commissioner of Public Safety, which certainly you could do a lot of good for the community, also in terms of giving opportunities for many of the young Irish immigrants to get jobs either in the police department or the fire department. There's definitely been mention about criticism of the commissioner about his enforcement of the prohibition laws. I don't know if that is colored by his working at Ballantyne, or the fact that many members of Local 55 were working at other breweries, that the economic hardship, or even his culture as an immigrant from Ireland, where drinking was part of the component in terms of being raised in pubs and coming here to Newark and going to bars. A lot of times years ago, and I've said this before, a bar owner in Newark was more important than the ward governmental official, because young Irish immigrants went to that bar owner in terms of housing, went there in terms of leads on job opportunities, even solicited a loan, and in some cases even met their spouse. I know a lot of different places, even now today, McGovern's Tavern on New Street has that tradition. So it's still there after all of these years. So looking at the commissioner's life and his involvement with the labor movement, the interesting thing, he gave my father a job in 1929 at the Prudential Insurance as an oiler for 1 day a week, which was really quite an accomplishment just for 1 day a week. So it was just a case at that time as a job, and really that's the kind of person he was. But my sense in those formative years, he had a tremendous influence as far as the justice is concerned, and even when he went to work for Pitney Hardin, I think that labor union attorneys gave him a lot of slack, they gave more slack than they would normally another corporate type attorney, because he kind of maybe coasted to a certain degree on the reputation of his father for all those years in the labor movement, and he was able to kind of resolve some conflicts as far as strikes and labor issues, and probably was a lot more of a diplomat, kind of learned this maybe from some of the leadership skills that had been brought out by his father. As far as the issue of politics is concerned, I guess they beat him up about not enforcing the prohibition laws, and maybe the temperance people and then the Newark News at the time did that, but he still was very popular, and even, as was mentioned by Seth, to have that record number of people come out for a funeral indicates the reverence that he was felt as far as Newark is concerned. So I think that he definitely had an impact, and over the years with the different things that cropped up as far as decisions were made on the court. The interesting thing, and I remember I was in high school, and I was reading about this issue of the reapportionment, or the one man, one vote decision. And I looked at this, and I said to my father, and he thought I was crazy. I said, they might have more senators like in Essex County next year. He said, where are you getting that from? I said, I've been reading this thing about the court decision is pending. And sure enough, the following year they had 4 senators at large in Essex County. My father proved to be one of the people who benefited from that Justice Brennan decision. So the Brennans were kind of taking care of the Giblins in more ways than one. So I just want to kind of end on that note as far as Justice Brennan was concerned. He was also president of the Essex Trades Council, which was the forerunner of the Essex West Hudson Labor Council. And that issue of the public service strike, that was with the trolleyman, the bus that he ran into conflict, and of course understood about the power of the police. So it was probably interesting with those people who were kind of surrounding him with horses and things like that, and not too long later he was the commissioner and kind of giving them orders, so I'm sure he had a pretty good memory. So I just want to kind of share that insight as far as the issues related to the Justice's father and how much he meant to Newark, and I think we're all proud to have him as one of our sons. Thank you.
Well, I'm Georgie Brennan, and I am delighted to be here. I think I was asked for 2 reasons. One is that I'm a real Newarker. I was born in 1936 in Newark. I grew up here. I was married within the city limits, and I worked for the Newark Star-Ledger for 12 years. So that makes me a real Newarker. And then they put me out to pasture to Princeton. But I think I've also invited to speak because of the Brennan, on behalf of the Brennan family, and that I'm delighted to do. There are a number of Brennans. We've been talking about tonight, there is the Commissioner Brennan, William J. Brennan, the Justice William J. Brennan, my husband that I married in 1960, who had died a few years ago, but he was a lawyer and president of the New Jersey Bar Association. He was number 3, and tonight I've got number 4, my son, with us. So that's number 4. He has 2 daughters, and we are very fortunate that neither daughter was named Williamette. I want to thank Seth for the documentation. When I read the book, I learned something. I was reminded of a lot, and it's a wonderful book, so please pick it up. If I have this opportunity, I'd like to dissuade everyone from even thinking of the idea that my father-in-law had any resemblance to a leprechaun. Several times people have said that. Well, forget it. I've never met a leprechaun, but I understand they're small, funny-looking, slightly daft, and live in the woods in Ireland. Now, my father-in-law never went to Ireland until latter years, so just forget that. He was an American. He thought of himself as an American. He loved baseball, American football, pledge allegiance to the flag and all that thing. This leprechaun thing does not wash. Talking about influences from Newark. A lot's been said about Commissioner Brennan, but that Bridget McDermott, I never met the commissioner because he died in 1930. But his wife, Bridget McDermott Brennan, boy, was she a piece of work. And a delightful lady. I got to know her quite well. And she was a force to be reckoned with. And she took care of command central of that family. And I would describe her as an education pusher. She certainly made sure every single one of those 7 children got a good education. Beyond that, she also was an advocate of lifelong learning. She was also a sports fan. She loved football and baseball. So she is an enormous influence on the justice, and the rest of us too. Papa would call her every single Sunday, no matter where he was. So there was a great attachment there. She was a good cook. But the commissioner won a live turkey one Thanksgiving at one of these political conventions or whatnot. And he brought this live turkey home. They put it in the backyard. And the kids fed it for a little while. And then Thanksgiving Day, he went out in the backyard and dispatched the turkey. So the children sat around the table, had not a drop of that turkey, but the mashed potatoes and green beans, and that was it. Now, some people are born to succeed. It's just their destiny. Some work hard, and others just love what they're doing, and they succeed. My father-in-law was all 3. Who else would on Christmas Day take out a card table, a yellow pad, and start running opinions? Good job. So they take him and they put him in a room, lock him in there for the day, and let him out when the polls close. So maybe that's the reason why he may not have gone for politics. Well, Bridget, back to her again. She had this wonderful feeling of this lifelong learning. And I can remember my father-in-law in Nantucket. His best friend was the librarian. And he would go to the library and get biographies, novels, the works, mysteries, whole armful, 2 or 3 days later, he'd go back, having read them all. And he loved that. He also loved learning from his clerks. That was one of his great joys. He was their mentor, yet when these young people came in to help him prepare his legal work, they brought a perspective. He learned what was going on with their families. He learned about their politics. He learned about a new world, so he never stopped. Now, before we get on to Brennan overload here, I'll just tell you what kind of parents they were, he and his wife. They were like doting grandparents. The 2 boys in South Orange were given BB guns, and they went next door and had a little target practice. So, father came home and took the 2 boys next door, and they apologized. The attitude was, boys will be boys. Nancy, their daughter, she'll kill me. But there was a ballet recital. But this just gives you an idea of the doting grandparents rather than the parents. They went to her recital, and Nancy sort of flip-flopped around the stage, and it was a little bit awkward. And they stood up, and they clapped. And wonderful, 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 poor Nancy. Papa had a wonderful, wonderful, powerful intellect. Wouldn't you agree? Just amazing. I think Seth knows, can read that stuff, and he was persuasive. He had a way of expressing thoughts. He could take ordinary words and string them together and make the most wonderful thoughts. That's talent, and just amazing. I want to share with you the idea that this is a land of opportunities. When I was married in 1960, there was someone who was a groomsman, one of my husband's good friends. His name was Jake Ballantyne. Jake was either the grandson or the great-grandson of the Ballantyne who ran the brewery that Justice Brennan's father used to pull the coal into them. So we go from the coal to having the son in the wedding. Also, a lot has been said about the commissioner. Well, he left Ireland, and it's a family story that he was sort of a nuisance. He was a political agitator. So it was best that he left before he got into more trouble. Along comes his son. This is only one generation. And I can remember we were in England. Papa was the guest of honor of the law lords in London at the reenactment of the signing of Magna Carta. So that's from getting nearly booted out of Ireland to being... So that's about it. He was a great, great father-in-law, and we love him all.
Thank you. I mean, those perspectives, it's just wonderful. And I thought I would just add a couple points. I think with the turkey, we have found the roots of Justice Brennan's empathy. Thank you. The mystery is solved. And the second point I want to make relates to the leprechaun. And that's a key theme in the book about his Irish Catholic identity. And it's striking from the day he's nominated. He was the court's now 6 Catholics and 3 Jews. It's kind of hard to imagine a day. There was what was called the Catholic seat and the Jewish seat. So 1 each, that's all they got. And Justice Brennan, there hadn't been a Catholic in about 7 years. Eisenhower picked him in part because of his religion. From the day he was nominated, he was portrayed in the New York Times and Time magazine as this happy little leprechaun. It was the worst kind of ethnic stereotyping and a caricature. And it came to define him, and it was false. And I think one of the things we try to do in the book is show that it wasn't true. on a personal level, and it wasn't true on a professional level. He wasn't successful because he was some Irish ward boss slapping backs and twisting arms in the halls of the Supreme Court. He was successful because of his intellect. He was successful because he was a skilled consensus builder that was able to accommodate the needs of his colleagues. But he wasn't some little leprechaun. He deeply resented the idea, and in his second interview with my co-author, Steve Wormeal, in 1986, the only thing he ever told Steve that he needed to do was get rid of that damn nonsense about me being some Irish Paul. So, you'd hope that we've gotten beyond that era, but then last year with Justice Sotomayor, it was striking the degree to which she was sort of portrayed as the fiery Latina. So I don't think the era of ethnic stereotyping has completely disappeared, even though you now have a court that's composed entirely of sort of ethnic minorities in some sense. So that's all I have to add. Thank you so much.
Okay, time for questions from the floor. Liz.
Was he a registered Republican?
Justice Brennan was a Democrat, and President Eisenhower was explicitly looking for a Democrat, a Catholic. It was 1956, fall, September of 1956, and Eisenhower was running for re-election. He wound up beating Adlai Stevenson for a second time by a very wide margin, but at that moment in September, it wasn't altogether clear. He wanted someone who would appeal to voters in the Northeast. There was this young senator named John F. Kennedy going around campaigning on behalf of Stevenson. So there was a real appeal in a Democrat and a Catholic who could win some votes in the Northeast. But Justice Brennan he would talk to my co-author in the course of these interviews about nearly anything, completely no holds barred. He would never say who he would vote for had he voted in 1956. He just refused. That was perhaps his deepest held secret. So we'll never know who he would have voted for between Stevenson and Eisenhower.
Because that's an unusual nomination.
Yeah.
Well, did Bernie Shanley have an effort?
Sure. Bernard Shanley was a top official in the White House in the Eisenhower administration. He was from New Jersey. He knew Justice Brennan, and another one of these connections that show sort of upward mobility. When Justice Brennan's father came to Newark, one of his first jobs was as a laborer laying tracks for the trolley line owned by the Shanley family. And then a generation later, his son is nominated to the Supreme Court in the administration in which Shanley's son served. Shanley didn't really play a role in the decision. It was really the Attorney General, Herbert Brownell, and his deputy, William Rogers. Brennan never believed that Shanley didn't play a role. He, 20 years later, was still going up and saying, Bernie, come on, be honest. We know you were involved. But neither he nor the Labor Secretary, I believe, was also a New Jersey guy.
Jim Mitchell.
Yeah, neither of them were involved. Shanley got involved after the fact. He was sort of the liaison with the Catholic community, and he'd been asked to sort of vet him, go find out what the parish priest thought, that kind of stuff. But at that point, the decision had really been made that this was their nominee, and they were just doing the follow-through. So.
Mr. Brennan, did he live in South Orange? And what year?
Did he live in South Orange?
Yes.
Yes. So I apologize for my
You didn't know what orange
my orange confusion, but he did. I did believe he lived in South Orange. I apologize for anyone here from any of those communities. I don't mean to offend.
What year was he in South Orange?
Sure, he was there in the 1930s. He moved mid-1930s. He lived there through when they moved to Rumson in 1952, when he joined the New Jersey Supreme Court. There was a period of time during the war. He was in the Army. He served in Washington, D.C. and Los Angeles, so he was in New Jersey at that time period, but basically from the mid-1930s till 1952, he was living there.
Oh, also, my colleague wants to know, was he first Irish?
No, there were several Catholic and Irish Catholic justices who served before him, including Frank Murphy. the predecessor in what was known as the Catholic seat. But there were ways, and we talk about in the book, where his identity as an Irish Catholic sort of came into conflict with his role as a justice. He never decided any cases based on what the church might have wanted, but there was some backlash, and it caused him real anguish on school prayer, on obscenity, and then, of course, on abortion in the 70s. But this went on way before abortion, I mean, into the early 60s, where high figures in the church were not at all pleased with the decisions. And he really resented news stories that would say, Justice Brennan, the court sole Catholic, voted so-and-so. And it was an unfortunate position to be in, that for 30 years, until Scalia joined in 1986, he was sort of cast as the House Catholic. And if you look at Roe v. Wade, during consideration of that case, Justice Blackmun, who was the author, sent him a memo and said, hey, Bill, do you mind taking a look at this language related to the church's position, as if Justice Brennan was some theologian. I mean, he had stopped going to parochial school as an elementary school student. He continued to go to like Sunday school, but in his interviews with my co-author, he clearly had more vivid memories of playing pool in the church rec room than what he was learning in terms of theology. So it was sort of silly to think just because you're Catholic, you're the in-house expert, but that was the role both externally and within the court that he was put in.
Ma'am?
And we heard a lot about Justice Brennan and his father. I would like to know more about Justice and William Brennan III. I know that the father is very proud about his son, and his son, after military service, called collect to his parents that I'm accepted by Yale Law School. And however, later he started his career in New Jersey rather difficultly. And he was charged, asked by the governor and the attorney general to get rid of the mafia influence.
Right. We talk about that in the book. I mean, let me make clear, Justice Brennan was very proud of all three of his children. Only one of the three became a lawyer. It was his namesake son, and I guess coincidentally, perhaps, his namesake grandson also became a lawyer. Justice Brennan, his son, as we recount in the book, did have an incident in 1968-69. He had left private practice and gone to work for the Attorney General in New Jersey, and was put in this position of investigating the mob. Now, it quickly became clear that the mob influence was tremendous. Justice Brennan's son said so publicly and sort of named names in some sense, and quickly got thrown under the bus. He got pushed out. And just as, interestingly, just as Justice Brennan soured on politics watching his father, I think, now, given that his wife and son are here, I shouldn't be, I feel a little strange, but I think it soured him on politics, where he really was turned off to it. And interestingly, he was also turned off to a career in the judiciary. Justice Brennan made the point to my co-author that his son had been offered to become a judge, either at the state or the federal level, and his son saw particularly the financial sacrifices, which were tremendous, that Justice Brennan had to make, and he wasn't interested. So it's interesting, each generation, their career was shaped by, in some sense, by the negative experiences of those before them.
I want to quote this in William Brennan III, and during that period of time, quote his grandfather. And grandfather said that you've got to remember there's a difference between Democrats and the Republicans. And Democrats will steal a hot stove, Republican put on their gloves first. That's wondering what advice he got from his father during that difficult period of time.
Well, you know, it was a difficult period on many levels. There was fear of mob retribution, which wasn't beyond the scope of possibility given the nature of the charges he had made. And Justice Brennan was also concerned. He knew enough about New Jersey politics to know that his son was going to be sort of sacrificed. and thrown out. But he was vindicated. Within a year, the U.S. Attorney in New Jersey indicted dozens of people, including as some of the legislators he had named were eventually investigated, sent to the grand jury. So vindication wasn't long in coming, but by that point he had completely soured on politics and didn't want any part of it, even if asked, I think is the way to characterize. Well, they would know better than I, but I hope I'm getting that right.
He was asked by Arthur Sills to do an investigation, and he had access to all the state troopers, the state information. And actually, he was at a public thing, and some reporter asked him, is there infiltration in the State House? And he said, I think the words were, they are too comfortable with organized crime, which is not accusing somebody, but there was a row after that. I mean, he tried to be as...
It was an explosion. I mean, it was a speech to a society of journalists in New Jersey, and it was the biggest story of its day in New Jersey. It was covered in all the New Jersey papers. It was covered in the New York Times. It was a huge story at the time. That anyway.
For someone in Giblin, especially, I have a particular interest in the Iron Bound, and of course Valentine was the mainstay there. Was the Brennan Sr. there until his death all those years?
No, he became a full-time officer of Local 55. If I remember, there's one interesting thing talking about Valentine, the justice's brother, Frank, two things I want to mention about him. Prior to the change to the county executive form of government, there was an Essex County Park Commission. For a number of years, Frank Brennan served as the president of the Essex County Park Commission. And a lot of the good things, even now continue today in the parks, was as a result of his leadership.
First one in the country, yeah.
But then on top of that, Frank Brennan, I believe, was a general counsel to P. Valentine, right?
Yeah.
Which is really interesting, that the coal passer's son became the general counsel to P. Valentine.
And then Gallo.
Okay, I wasn't sure, but I knew he
For
was...
the Gallo brothers in California.
I knew he was definitely at P. Valentine as a general counsel. But like he worked as an officer, he was like basically a business agent of Local 55, the Firemen and Oilers.
So maybe did not make that commute from Vailsburg to Freeman Street every day for 40 years.
No, I think he was only there a couple of years.
Right.
That was my sense. I mean,
Roger?
Just a quick question. What was your relationship with Thurgood Marshall in the judge?
That is one of the most sensitive issues we address in the book. Justice Brennan had tremendous respect for Thurgood Marshall. He was the pioneering lawyer for the NAACP, basically the legal strategy, knocking down segregation piece by piece. That was Thurgood Marshall. Justice Brennan joined the court in 1956, and Thurgood Marshall argued many of those cases before the court. He saw him in action and said repeatedly that he considered Marshall perhaps the most skilled litigator he ever saw argue before the court. He saw him argue when Marshall became the nation's first African-American Solicitor General, the top lawyer for the Justice Department, who argues cases on behalf of the government. But it was an issue of much sensitivity and something he never talked about publicly until he told my co-author. He was disappointed with Justice Marshall. He had a sense that in the 70s and 80s that Justice Marshall sort of gave up, that the conservatives were on the march, and that Brennan was sort of doing double duty on defense, that Justice Marshall wasn't doing his share of the heavy lifting in preserving the gains of the Warren years. But he refused to ever say anything about that publicly because he felt that Marshall never got the due he deserved for all that he had achieved as a lawyer and judge, and Brennan didn't want to do anything to take away from that. In fact, every chance he got, Brennan spoke publicly. Marshall didn't like to talk publicly. He didn't give a lot of speeches, particularly as he got older. And every invitation, Brennan would go and would praise Marshall for all he had accomplished. He really thought it was racism, that the reason that Marshall didn't get the credit he deserved was pure racism, and he didn't want to do anything to contribute to that. So it's an issue of sensitivity. I hope we handle it sensitively. It's striking this summer, the nomination of Elena Kagan, who was a clerk to Justice Marshall. The hearings felt at times like the second confirmation of Justice Marshall. It was almost as if he was on trial. And so it continues, the way that Justice Marshall, his accomplishments are sort of minimized. You saw that even this year.
Guy?
I'd just like to make two brief observations, if I could. First off, Georgie Brennan, who very humbly was described as a reporter for the Star-Ledger, was actually something more than a reporter for the Star-Ledger, because I remember on at least several occasions when Newark Pye, who was a longtime editor of the paper, credited Georgie with not only helping maintain, but also build the Star-Ledger circulation at a time when it was in a pitched circulation battle with the Newark News. That's number one. Second of all, the house that Justice Brennan grew up in Vailsburg, is still standing. I've been through the house, and I dearly hope that the city of Newark and people who love this city's history will keep an eye on that house so it does not fall to the same condition that Stephen Crane's house fell to. So
It's up by the new Speedway School.
Right, and it's actually kind of an interesting house because there's a portion of the backyard that's in East Orange. So it's right on the border. It's a greenhouse. I've been to the house. I talked to the owner of the house now. He was having some financial difficulties with it, but it's kind of a marginal neighborhood, but still something that we need to keep our eye on and make sure that it doesn't go the same way as the Stephen Crane house.
Seth, is it true that Justice Brennan never had any female clerks?
That's not true. Let me set the record straight there. His attitude towards women clerks has gotten more attention than anything in this book, and it's a big fat book. Justice Brennan, there's a contrast. We talk about a big theme in the book is sort of Justice Brennan, the liberal champion, like the subtitle, and Justice Brennan, the more conservative man. And there's this notion that liberal activist judges running amok are imparting their personal preferences into the law, and that wasn't really true. He was not always aligned his personal views in what he did as a justice. You saw that on abortion. He was uncomfortable personally with abortion, but paved the way for it with his privacy decisions and helped craft the Roe v. Wade decision. You see it on the free press. He was a champion of the free press. Reporters infuriated him. Interestingly, 2 of his 3 children happened to marry reporters, and his wife was a proofreader at a newspaper. And particularly on the issue of women. He wrote the most important women's rights decisions of the 70s, and yet in 1970, the first time a woman clerk was recommended to him, he said, send me someone else, because he wasn't comfortable with the idea of a woman in his chambers. After he had written some pivotal women's rights decisions, the same clerk, former clerk who is now a professor at Berkeley, said, I've got another woman for you. And he said, send me someone else again. But at that point, that clerk said, Justice sent him a letter that we quote, that hadn't been revealed before, and says, Justice Brennan, with all due respect, you're being a hypocrite, and not only are you being a hypocrite, you could be sued under the very precedents that you wrote. That was the point at which Justice Brennan, to his credit, relented and hired his first female clerk. In the 1980s, he had several more women clerks. It was, I think, he had a very sort of old school mentality. He liked to tell an occasional story with a curse word in it, and he didn't want to sort of sully the ears of a woman. It was a notion that was perhaps outdated, but it meant of his generation. He got over it, and it didn't affect his ability to really alter the course of women's rights. So he did never have an African-American clerk. The first one was scheduled to start in the term that began in 1990. He actually retired, announced his retirement on a Friday, and that clerk was supposed to start on Monday. So he didn't have an African-American clerk. I mean, none of the justices of that era really necessarily distinguished themselves with the diversity of their hiring in many respects. But Justice Brennan said it was more of a pipeline issue. There weren't enough women or enough minority clerks. That was his explanation. But that was sort of the demographics.
He had a deal with a friend
Right.
at Harvard. Send me.
Right.
Send me two.
The beginning, and the way his clerkship hiring, every justice when he started at the court got 2 clerks. That eventually went up to 4 per justice. For the first 7 or so terms, he relied on a professor at Harvard Law School who would recommend 2 Harvard graduates. And this was actually recommended by Felix Frankfurter, who as a professor there had been a similar feeder to justices, and Frankfurter similarly relied on a justice. Brennan abandoned that model, felt it was too narrow, other people weren't getting an opportunity, and he started relying on former clerks and deans of law schools and friends who were federal judges, particularly 2 on the D.C. Circuit, the Court of Appeals, David Bazelon and J. Skelly Wright. They were very close friends of his, and they became his key feeders, where you would go and you would clerk in their chambers for a year, and then it was sort of understood almost that that was a stepping stone. You would move on to Justice Brennan's chambers. So he never directly hired his own clerks. It was interesting, in a speech in the 1980s, kind of an insightful thing, he said, you know, I can't say no. If a law student is sitting across from me, I interview them. He didn't like conflict. He didn't like to say no. And I think that was part of it. He just didn't want to be in that position of having to choose and say no.
Did the justice work with Justice O'Connor? Was she on the bench when he?
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
And how did they get along?
Well, to be...
There's been some
right.
about his ideas about women justices.
Well,
I'm reading it in reviews. You know.
It didn't go so well. Justice O'Connor joined the court in 1981, and you know, Justice Brennan was someone who prided himself on getting along with all of his colleagues. They didn't mesh, and how much of that was gender, how much of that was interpersonal style, how much of that was that it was a very difficult period in Justice Brennan's life. His wife had battled cancer for 12 years at that point and would pass away the following year. So this was a very difficult period in his life, and he wasn't able to play the same role. He almost was the orientation counselor for so many justices, Justice Marshall, Justice Goldberg in the 60s, where he would sort of take them under his wing, not in a demeaning way, but just in a very friendly way. He couldn't do that with Justice O'Connor. He was so distracted by what was happening at home. And so it was a number of factors that contributed to this, and some of their initial interactions, some of the language that Justice Brennan and his clerks used in an opinion early in her tenure really alienated her, poisoned the well, and there was a certain level of distrust. Interestingly, after he left the court, so much of his legacy is intact. Sort of the decisions he wrote weren't overturned, and much of the credit goes to Sandra Day O'Connor, because she moved more to the center and was a key swing vote, along with David Souter, his successor on the Supreme Court, proved to be more liberal than expected. So even though they didn't get along, in so many ways, his legacy was preserved. Well, I don't think she was doing it intentionally to save Brennan's legacy, but that there is that sort of interconnected.
I did ask him personally whether he thought that Justice O'Connor was qualified and could she handle the material. And he said, absolutely.
Oh, there's no question.
He had respect for her.
Absolutely. He had tremendous respect for her, and he had even more respect for Ruth Bader Ginsburg, not more, but tremendous respect for Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who had been the lawyer for the ACLU's Women's Rights Project, arguing all of those women's rights cases in the 70s. And a chapter of the book, we show that sort of interaction where she was arguing and playing this role. We interviewed her, and she said she viewed herself, she was a law professor at the time, first at Rutgers and then at Columbia, educating the justices, that she viewed these were men of a certain generation who had notions about women, and she was going to educate them. And that's what she did. And she really changed Brennan's attitudes and some of the other justices through her oral arguments.
Just heard about the Justice Brennan in several regards. In his legal writings, was there much evolution there in his thinking and in the opinions that you wrote?
Absolutely. You see it in a few areas. I mean, not as much as some justices. They come like a Harry Blackmun or John Paul Stevens, where they're expected to be a certain way, and over the course of their career, there's this notion they drift. I don't think you see that with Brennan, but he joined the court. He had the perspective of a state Supreme Court justice, and he really had this notion, particularly on federal criminal procedure, what's called habeas corpus, that was federal judges interfering in what state courts were doing, because he was a state court judge, and that was his perspective. But as he served in his early years, he really came to see things differently, that a lot of southern state judges weren't quite as scrupulous as he was, or his colleagues were in New Jersey, and he felt that the federal courts really did need to almost play an oversight role of the state courts. He also came to change his position on obscenity and staked out a more sort of absolutist position on the death penalty, and that happened in the 1970s. His role had changed from building the liberal majorities into more of a dissenter, and so his role changed, and he felt perhaps more comfortable playing a different role and taking some more absolutist positions.
I just want to ask where all the original interviews are that were done for the book, and will they be available?
Sure. A lot of the materials that we relied upon are at the Library of Congress. Some of them are already open. Others will open to the public fully in 2017 under the terms of that he granted the control to the Library of Congress, or that's where they're deposited. As for the interviews, my colleague, my co-author, Steve Wormeal, did, as I mentioned, 60 hours of interviews. The first thing I did when I joined the project in 2006, I read the transcript. It's larger than a phone book. Our goal, and Steve's goal, is to make that accessible to the public. We're in the process of making them digital. This was 1986. This is all tape, actual tapes. And he's talking and would like to talk with the family about sort of how to make everything public. I'd very much like to annotate the transcript, because anyone recalling events 50 years earlier gets little things wrong, and we found dates he might have gotten off for a vote in the Senate. So I'd like to have it annotated just so researchers in the future, it's all there. They don't have to do that sort of fact-checking as they use it as a resource.
And the other ones, the Ruth Bader Ginsburg and so on?
Oh, well, we relied on the papers of the other interviews. Well, we didn't tape. It's not really nice to stick a tape recorder in front of a justice and be like, so those we were, that was by hand. Steve has some of his interviews with justices he had done in the 80s. Between us, we interviewed 12 other justices in addition to Justice Brennan. And that, we'll obviously be talking about how to make materials available. That's the goal, is to make it as available as possible.
Last question, Don?
Yeah. I really just want to add a footnote. In 1925, Justice Brennan's father founded a bank called the Labor Cooperative National Bank. I don't know if it's in the book, but I later became chairman of that when it survived the Depression and other things in 1960, 1991. But I communicated with Justice Brennan about that, and he said his father was really very happy about that. It was a labor bank. In those days, they formed labor banks. And this was Labor Cooperative National Bank. It changed its name to Labor National Bank, then Broad National Bank, and today it's Sovereign Santander, if you're interested.
Okay, I'd like to wrap up now. Okay, any last comments from the panel? We have books for sale. If you don't want to buy one tonight, you can get them on Amazon. Still gets royalties.
They're cheaper tonight.
Okay, I think one thing that Seth has emphasized is that Justice Brennan was not a leprechaun, was not an Irish pal, was not very PC as we see it. and all the stereotypes. You shouldn't be using those adjectives. One thing the Newark History Society has repeatedly said is that every story about Newark doesn't have to have the words gritty and hardscrabble in it either. So we're very glad and grateful to Seth for writing this book, for the deep research and the information is brought forward, and to all of our panelists, and we hope to see you at the next meetings.